Welcome to the Brain Development Podcast. We're here to show parents that there is a pathway to healing the behavioural and learning symptoms of your autistic, dyslexic, ADHD, OCD, Asperger's, dyslexic, dyspraxic, or dysgraphic child. And my purpose is to help empower parents to understand how they can build their child's brain from the bottom up to invoke change. And today we have Vicky from Healthy Happy Unicorn. Hi, Vicky.
Hello, it's nice to be here again. Thank you for having me.
We're going to talk about methylation this time and the importance of methylation in the body and why we see methylation issues in lots of these neurodiverse children. So tell me a bit about it.
Okay, so methylation's one of these topics that I think people get really overwhelmed with, and I did as well. So when I first started with Rose, everyone was saying, oh, methylation and MTHFR and all these things, and I couldn't really understand it. So I sat for about a month and I just got my head around it by researching and looking at diagrams and everything else. And I sort of consolidated it in my mind. And then later, I actually trained with the Walsh Institute, who is this lovely old man who has done the biggest research on autism populations and autism brains and like in mental health populations like bipolar and depression, anxiety, and those kind of conditions. So I learned loads from him as well. And basically, methylation is like a load of cogs, like almost in a clock, turning together to achieve a specific outcome. And these cogs are turning constantly in our bodies. So if you think about methylation like it's a cycle to produce a thing called methyl. And methyl is attached to things to make them work properly. And so the way that Dr. Walsh described it was it's like a key to a lock. So you can have a certain neurotransmitter, for an example, or a brain chemical or a hormone, but if you don't have the methyl group to turn it on or off, then that's just not going to work properly. And then Dr. Ben Lynch, who I admire as well, he talks a lot about the genetics and these SNPs and things like that. And he spoke about it like almost like being a uniform. So if you think about the methyl group, if you think about like Clark Kent, he's like, you know, without methyl. And then when he puts his cape on, his uniform, that he would have methyl and then he'd have this superpower. So it's almost like catalyzing change via these little groups called methyl groups. And so that's like a simplified sort of like explanation of it. But obviously it's really complex and every single function in the body is reliant on this. And it's heavily sort of impacted typically in people with autism. So in someone with an autism diagnosis, typically they are under-methylated, which means that they don't create enough of the methyl groups. So of course that's going to impact how their functionality works. So in like a more biological sense, if you think about methylation and the main like methionine cycle it's called, it would be helpful if I had a diagram to show you, but maybe you can link a picture so people can see a visual. But it's like a cycle which recycles homocysteine. Mm-hmm. And so you get homocysteine and then you go round a cycle and then you've got the folate cycle, which is like, you know, B12 and folate dependent and other nutrient dependent. That gets recycled into S-adenosyl methionine, and then that goes round. And then you create something called SAMe, which is a number one methyl donor. So basically the whole point of that is to create SAMe so that you can, which is a donor of methyl, two things to make them work. So in people with autism, that cycle is usually not working very effectively. And so I want to talk about this a lot because there's a lot of sort of like miscommunication with like what is meant to be done about someone with under-methylation. So first of all, a lot of people come to me and they say, okay, well, I've got the MTHFR, my child's got the MTHFR, so they need to have loads of folate. Well, actually, if you think about the cycle, so it's a big like recycling of homocysteine, that's basically what's happening. So there is a folate cycle that is dependent on, so you do need folate for that cycle. However, in each sort of cycle in the body, there is always a backup system. So, and what we found is that usually one of those is working okay. So like if if this folate cycle isn't working very well, you can go up, instead of going round the cycle, round the folate cycle, you can go up the middle, and then you can recycle homocysteine directly that way into methionine, which is what we need. So, and that cycle or that pathway is dependent on other nutrients like choline and DMG, and you need to be able to metabolize fat for that process to work effectively. So I think what I'm trying to say here is that I think when we get this methylation sort of this discussion, everyone's go-to is, oh, it's the folate cycle. We must put like high dose folate in for these children or this person. Well, Dr. Walsh's research shows us that actually when you are under-methylated, it typically means that your serotonin is very depressed. That's part of that picture. And so folate, just by part of its mechanism, actually does depress serotonin. So if you've got someone that's already very undermethylated and then you put high dose folate in for that person, this isn't always what happens, but if that person already has depressed serotonin, and actually in some children they have very high serotonin, so in those children it would be okay. But mostly this is what happens. So you put the high dose folate in and the child gets loads worse because what you're doing is you're depressing the serotonin further. The other thing is, and this is why like we go back to these basics all the time, don't we? And there's so much that can be said on this topic. But of course, like a lot of what we see is, okay, oh, there's a methylation impairment. All right, well, let's just put like B12 shots and really high dose folate in without any other consideration for what is actually impacting that cycle. And there are so many things which I'll cover. And so the other thing to think about is that folate is a methyl donor, but outside the cell's nucleus, it actually strips the nucleus of the cell of methyl. So again, in an undermethylated person, it can actually make the symptoms of undermethylation worse if you put really high dose folate in. So actually in practice, it's something that I tend to avoid until, like much, much, much later on, if we really need to do something like a FRAT test, which is a folate receptor antibody test to see if those folate receptors are blocked and if we truly need the folate. Because actually we know as well, just going back to our basics, that B vitamins are created in our gut. So if your gut is not functioning, you're not going to create those vitamins very well. The other thing to consider is that the methylation cycle is inhibited by things like toxins, by things like mercury, from vaccines. It's inhibited by yeast even. So if you've got a massive candida overgrowth, it will inhibit the enzymes that you need to recycle homocysteine properly and actually to go around this cycle. So it's almost like, again, and it sounds too simple and it sounds too easy, but it's almost like if we just focus on the basic foundations first. And I've actually seen this in practice where a little boy came to me and he came to me on B12 shots and the parents were desperate to get him off because it's very invasive. You're like putting a needle in your child every day. And I'm not, if everyone has to follow their own path and do whatever they feel is best for their child and whatever your gut is driven to do, I would never criticise or judge. Like you have to do what you think is right. But they were saying, I really want to go more naturally. I don't want to do this for the rest of his life.
Yeah.
And actually, his first methylation profile was extremely under-methylated, right? So he wasn't making methyl very well. And we were and logically, from my perspective, because a lot of the research is saying, when you're born with a certain methylation status, that's it for life. You can't change that. But in my head, I'm like a bit of a, don't want to swear on the podcast, but I'm a bit of an idiot really sometimes. And I'm like, I won't accept that. Like I need to, this doesn't seem logical in my brain, knowing what I know about the human body. And so we did loads of different things for him in terms of his gut balancing and just simple things like hydration, because his bowel movements were really sluggish as well. So we knew his gut wasn't functioning. And we got his stomach acid really optimized because you have to have stomach acid to absorb B12, right? So we were doing it from a very natural perspective. And then, many years later, so the first methylation was taken when he was 3 or something. This was when he was about 10, actually. And I hadn't worked with him for 7 years. I'd only worked with him for about a year. But when we did his next methylation profile, it was normally methylating. And it was like, you're just thinking like, this is crazy, because we know like if you look, because the body's so intricate and fascinating and there's so many systems, and you think, of course you can change that. Of course you can change that status, because all we're doing is trying to create a methyl group via a cycle that we know is impacted by so many cofactors and toxicity and gut issues. So if we can like clear all of that, we unburden that cycle, and then we can actually make the SAMI like, as well as we can. But of course, that isn't sort of the typical line that a lot of people go down. And then, so for the people who are under-methylated, it's so funny because when I trained under Dr. Walsh, he showed us the symptoms and traits charts of like what an under-methylated person looks like and what an over-methylated person looks like. And it's so interesting because it's always accurate. And it's like,
what are those what are those behaviours? What would you see within either of those groups?
Yeah, so for an under-methylated person, it would be a lot of OCD, a lot of rigidity. They might have, like compulsion, like obsessive compulsions, which is obviously OCD. There will be allergies in that person, or at least seasonal allergies, because obviously methylation has an inverse relationship with histamine, because methylation breaks down histamine. So of course, if you are under-methylated and you're not making those methyl groups very well, you're going to have an increase in histamine. And we know that's a problem for lots of our kids anyway, because we know some gut bugs can create more histamine. They're deficient in some of the cofactors that are required to break down histamine. And a lot of the copper's not bound, and we need that bound to break down histamine, because oxidative stress causes that. And so you'll see that in those people, and it's and they might need a lot of order. And the thing is about that, in terms of like the biochemistry of that, is there's a receptor called the NMDA receptor, and it regulates your glutamate and GABA. And in those people, that is dysregulated. So you can then find that there's more of those sort of obsessive behaviours in those kind of people, because there's an excess of glutamate. Right. And it's just so fascinating. And then if you're over-methylated, and it's so funny because actually, and I don't actually know the science behind this, but typically, not in every person, under-methylated people, because they're very tense, sort of overactive people, you tend to find they're very little and slender. And those people actually, under-methylated people are typically people who are doctors. They're very like type A people. They're like really hyper-focused because of their biochemistry. So actually, it's not always a negative thing. Like it can actually be, for those people, it can be something like it's not always symptomatic, if that makes sense. So, in our kids, that there's layers and layers of other things. And so the under-methylation is more stark because there's loads more toxicity. There's gut issues. There's like oxidative stress. There's all those things. So in those children, and there'll be infections and like probably brain autoimmunity as well. So in those children, you're going to see those symptoms a lot more stark, and actually they're going to impact their functioning in a really probably more negative way. But actually for somebody who's under-methylated without all of that, it can be really, it's almost like a superpower in some, because they're so hyper-focused that their brain can work so quickly and do so much more than, somebody who is probably normally methylated. So whenever Dr. Walsh runs his training, he always goes around the room and he says, I know I'm sitting in front of a whole group here of under-methylated people, because we're all there going, like desperate for the detail, and desperate to learn all this stuff. And they're all like really top doctors and like clinicians in their field. And so it's really interesting. And that's obviously, again, where you would see that dynamic of the, that autism spectrum, I suppose, where you're going to get really high functioning people who are under-methylated, who are autistic, and then the people who are very, possibly have a lower functionality because they've got all the other layers on top that are, crowding out their functioning even more. And then for an over-methylated person, these people you would see struggle with, because if someone's over-methylated, they've got too many methyl groups. So everything's going to be, it's almost like an anxious picture, because everything's running too quickly almost, in that sense. So, Yeah, and it's so fascinating. Like I'll share like my symptoms and traits chart just for fun, so people can have a look at that themselves. But so do you want me to talk about sort of what we do now in terms of that?
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah. So for me, if I see an under-methylated person, and the way, so just to say about the testing, there's a couple of things that you can do to test for this in your children, and just to also say that I wouldn't even probably look at methylation status until you'd done the basics, because it would be pointless. Because of course, if you've got major gut imbalances, loads of other layers of toxicity, then this person's methylation cycle is obviously going to be impaired. And that's the other thing to talk about, is that actually a lot of people will say, oh, well, I've got MTHFR, that means I've got impaired methylation. It does. It doesn't show if you're under or over methylated, though. So you would never look at genetic mutations for this, really. You would look at either whole blood histamine, but actually that's an older sort of test to do now, because we know histamine has an inverse relationship with methylation. So typically if someone's histamine's really high, then of course this person, you would make that assumption that they are under-methylated, because they haven't got enough methyl groups to break it down. And if their histamine's lower, like a lot lower, then of course they'd be over-methylated because they've got a lot of methyl breaking down histamine. And then in between that summer, so I think it's around 40 to 70 on a whole blood histamine panel, is like a normally methylating person. But that's an older sort of way of doing it now. And actually we know that a lot of things can actually impact histamine. So even some of the SSRIs that people are put on, who would come to us, some children are on those already, some adults with mental health and who have autism diagnoses will be on those medications as well, and they can dampen the histamine load. So of course sometimes that test could not be as accurate. So what I tend to use more now, and this is in the advanced training that we just took from Dr. Walsh, he speaks about a lot, is the SAM-SAR ratio. And just to put that into perspective, so I feel like this is not really, so the biology of it is really hard to picture, but if you imagine that cycle again of recycling homocysteine, go to the folate cycle, go up to methionine, come down the other side, and then you've got SAMI, which is a number one methyl donor, and then that goes back down into SAR, and then that goes back down into homocysteine. So and you're sort of recycling the whole thing, like the whole way round like that. So if you get the ratio between the SAR and the SAMI, you're going to see like what's happening there. So you're going to see how much SAMI is being created and how much SAR, and then you can see where the blockage is in the cycle. So that's a lot more of an accurate sort of diagnosis for that, for under and over methylation. So I typically use that quite a lot in practice. So what do we do if somebody is under-methylated? Well, from my perspective, I wouldn't actually run that test until much later, once we've done all the basics, and we want to look at the biochemistry if we need to. And in a lot of kids, you don't actually need to, because you've sorted out all the basic stuff, and that's enough for the child to actually thrive. But if you do then need to go into that further, or actually if somebody's already come to me, because a lot of people have already done all of those labs, and they'll come in and, their diet is really sort of rough. It's kind of like they're at the start of the healing journey, but they've done all those really high-end tests because that's kind of where they thought they should start. I would always still look at those basic things. So look at things like increasing the digestion. This sounds really like basic, but it's like if you can't digest protein, you're not going to access methionine, which is an essential part of your methylation cycle. So it's like methionine is like key to you creating SAMI, right? So it's like if you can't access that amino acid from protein, and so many kids have such poor digestion that they can't actually or they're not even eating meat. So like for these people,
Is that because they're not drinking enough? Is it that they're drinking too much at meal times and they've got less stomach acid? Like, what are the things that prevent them from breaking down proteins?
So lots of different things. So I'll go through them. So first of all, like 98% of children with autism, especially, because that's kind of like the research that we've seen recently, have low zinc. Well, zinc you have to create stomach acid. So if you don't have zinc, you're not you're not going to create stomach acid very well. You actually need protein to create stomach acid. So if you're not eating protein, or you can't access it very well, then you're not gonna, it's always like a cycle that, and then if you think about like a lot of our kids, and this goes into like your field, a lot of them can't chew properly.
Yeah, absolutely. And where does digestion start? It starts in the mouth.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, you have amylase and lipase in the mouth. So you don't actually have protease, which is like the protein digestion, but you're still working on it before you kind of, you still need to be able to chew it and like get the saliva sort of and get it kind of like that mastication going before it goes down. Because a lot of our kids are swallowing whole.
And if they're on white foods and that's all their diet is, and they're not accessing, because they just won't eat it, or it's very difficult to actually get them to eat any protein or any vegetables or anything that is, good for them, because they're living on white foods, that's also a big problem too. Yeah,
1,000,000%, because any phytates in foods, which is what our kids live off, isn't it? Like the beige food, it inhibits zinc.
Right.
So that inhibits zinc, and then sugars inhibit zinc. So most of our kids are living off sugar and carbs.
Yeah.
So it's just depleting all of that. And then if you think about other things, adrenaline has an inverse relationship with zinc. So if your child is like eating a load of beige carbs and they're in fight or flight their whole life, their zinc is like, they're just not.
Yeah, because they've got their Moreau and they're in that fight or flight state the whole time. Yeah, makes so much sense.
Yeah. So it's like you can see all these, and this is why I love the human body so much, because it's like if you get those basic things right, and it all leads back to that every time, doesn't it? We're like always going back to like the basic things from your perspective and my perspective. And if we can get those foundations laid, honestly, like, and then you can build on that. And there might be other bits that we need to do after that, but at least if you have that foundation laid, then you can really see a good picture. And so so obviously methionine is essential. So of course the first thing would be to get the digestion sorted and get the proper protein in. So things I use for that are things like, I love bromelain because it comes from a core of pineapple. So it's easy for kids to take because it's sweet, but it's, you can put it in a smoothie, or you can get a powder, and it tastes nice. So kids will take that happily. And then other things like, what we did with Rose when we first started, and people will probably squirm at this, but we used to get like bitter herbs, but we put them in applesauce and we'd just mix it in. And then, give her the applesauce, and she would happily eat the applesauce with the herbs in it. And it's kind of, and then you're getting the digestive processes. And like you said at the start as well, the hydration is so key, because it's like, if you don't have water in your body, you won't create stomach acid to break down these things. And it's just those basic things. And so the methionine is essential.
Can I just say on that? I think with the hydration, it's really understanding what are the signs that your child is dehydrated. You can obviously see like the lips kind of look all a bit, how do you describe them?
Well, I suppose like chapped, it looks,
chapped,
doesn't it? They're like
not
sunken,
full.
aren't they? Yeah,
sunken, chapped. They're not full lips. That's one sign. What other things? Surely they would look quite pale and kind of sunken around the eyes as well, dark circles. What are the other things that you'd say show?
I think like, because a lot of our kids, because they're malnourished, so it would be hard to tell like, oh, I'm going to look on your face, but the lips definitely.
Okay.
But the way I because with my own kids, how many times are they going for a wee in the day?
Yeah, true. And when you do go in there and they haven't flushed the toilet, is it like dark brown?
Yeah, exactly.
Rather than nearly clear, which it should be.
Yeah.
And really monitoring how much they should be drinking, and how much should a little kid be drinking. They say 6 to 8 glasses for an adult, but what would you say for a child?
So just to make it easy and visual for people, I just sort of say for every year of age, just add a cup.
Right.
And I mean, it's not an exact science, but like if you did that, you're kind of going to be, and I mean a cup as in a measuring cup, not like a full glass, like, so just, like that you bake with, one of those cups of water.
Yeah.
If you were drinking that as like an 8-year-old, if you drank 8 of those a day, that would be good. And then there's another way, there's actually a more scientific way of doing it, where you get your body weight in pounds and then you cut it in half. and then you would equate that in ounces of water. Like that's what Americans typically do. But like you could do that as well. But I think, and it's hard to get your children to drink because of course, like when we were going through this with Rose, she has no interoceptive senses. And obviously that comes back onto what you do. You know, she couldn't feel her body at all. She didn't know where she was in time and space. So of course, and she couldn't feel her internal cues. So she didn't know when she was hungry or full. She didn't ever feel thirst, and she didn't feel pain.
Yeah.
So, you know, and so then it's like a case of making it a fun activity rather than it being you, because otherwise you're just going to chase them around with a bottle of water the whole day. And it's like, it becomes stressful and forceful.
It is stressful. It's just another thing that you have to think about.
Yeah.
So yeah, it needs to be put into the routine.
Yeah. So that's sort of like the first thing would be, is the child accessing protein? Because we know that actually a vegan diet for people who are under-methylated is the worst diet, because you cannot access methionine very well on a vegan diet. Like you just can't. It's like, it's notoriously not bioavailable on that diet. And also the zinc that you desperately need is really difficult to get from like plant foods. It is there, but they also contain anti-nutrients, so they're kind of blocking the absorption. So meat for these children is so important, and obviously none of them want to eat it. So, so some things that I do in practice are I would blend it, so like they can't even see it. So if they have pasta and they like a sauce on it, you just blend the meat into the sauce. So you just blend like a chicken breast into that. Or you can make crackers with meat. You can put like eggs into muffins. You know, like there's so many ways we can find to put protein into the kids. And then, so then if you think about the next bit of the cycle, it's heavily potassium and magnesium dependent, because that conversion of methionine that comes back and goes into making SAMe, you have to have potassium and magnesium. Well, where does that come from? Well, vegetables. So it's like, it's going back to that basics of there must be meat in the diet, or fish or eggs, you know, or all three ideally, for the choline as well, the eggs for the choline, for that middle pathway, and vegetables. Like that diet, that caveman sort of like way about things is really how our kids should be eating. We know all the carbs and the phytates in those grains are blocking this cycle. They're blocking the zinc. They're anti-nutrients. We're not absorbing what we need in terms of the amino acids from that. So really I would focus on the protein and getting that digested properly, because you can have a child that eats loads of meat but they're not accessing any of it. And then the vegetables. So just as many vegetables in any way possible that and everyone on this podcast is going, yeah, okay. They're the two foods my kid hates and won't eat. But of course that's why, you know, it's personalised, individualised, and it's not like, oh, you have to go from eating a chicken nuggets only and pizzas to, all right, we're just going to serve meat and veg. Like, that isn't how we did it with Rose, and that isn't how typically I work in practice. You would look at where the child's at, look at what they're eating, and then you would slowly move on and add things and tweak, like in a sort of chaining way because you know your goal. We know the goal. But sometimes as well with parents that I work with, I don't tell them that goal at the start.
Oh, it's too scary. It's way too scary to think we're never going to get there. My child just, you know, won't eat it now. Yeah. And we're not going to get there. And I've tried. But you know, it's a journey. You have to just start small, and you put something in, you take something out, and it just slowly but surely. But your cookbook's bloody amazing. So it's got some incredible recipes in there. And so many of the parents I work with say, oh my God, have you tried this one? Have you tried this one? And all these different recipes. So they are really tasty. And, you know, those recipes do go down really well with lots and lots of families that I know. But also my family, my sister's family, she's used loads of them.
Bless her. Yeah. Oh, thank you. Yeah. So I think, I think it's like, so the diet obviously for me is like the first thing. And then I think it's like looking at any other toxicity that is causing harm, and of course removing anything that's really high folate. So if someone's very under-methylated and they've got a lot of the low serotonin symptoms like we're talking about, and the child's mood is very low and they might be quite aggressive, and say for an example they've been put on a diet where they're having a green smoothie every morning, that would be very unhelpful for these people. Because it's like it's like folate in a glass. Like, it's just so much there. And then there's other things we know with green, like really heavy green smoothies that are unhealthy, like the oxalates and stuff, which can also block methylation. So I would take out anything that's like really, and of course, like, we want diversity, but if they're eating spinach 3 times a day, they're eating beetroot 3 times, loads and excess of these foods, I would definitely think about avoiding those. And then thinking about stress as part of the picture. So we know that adrenaline inhibits SAMI. Like, they have an inverse relationship as well. So adrenaline and SAMI have an inverse relationship. Adrenaline and zinc have an inverse relationship. So stressors, something I always look at when I'm meeting families is, how can we do this together, but in the least stressful way? And I know you work like that with kids. I remember when I watched you in practice once, and I loved it because there was a little girl there and she was in freeze, and there was an exercise that you knew would really help her to come out of that. And then what you did is you knew what the exercise was, and you knew the movement that her body had to make to get out of that. But we knew that child wouldn't actually do that because it was too scary for them. So you incorporated it, and I can't remember what you did, but it was in some really fun way that would incorporate into something that she enjoyed doing. So she was still accessing what we needed her to access, but she didn't really know that she was doing the exercise, really. And that's the beauty of it, is it? Having that sort of mind of being able to sort of intricately get the result you want and the goal that you need, but doing it in a way that is not too invasive and stressful for the person.
Exactly. And you have to find a way around it. Because I know that all of these exercises, inside out, but there are other ways to achieve them. You don't have to do these exercises. And some kids at the beginning, usually I find it takes 3 weeks. It's really interesting. And sometimes I tell the parents and sometimes I don't. But it is usually 3 weeks of constantly doing it. They just get into a routine and then they don't fight you anymore. But you have to be able to work around those initial 3 weeks. Otherwise, those parents are going to give up. And I just can't have the parents give up, because they need to be pretty determined to do the change, because you're changing that child's brain dependent on what age they're at. And they've gone through those years of brain development. One side is effectively stronger, more mature than the other, and we need to bring the other side up. So there are other ways of actually achieving those exercise goals and using different modalities, different ways of moving to get there. Yeah.
I love that, though. I think, and it's like and that's what I love about, and I know we're the same, and that's what I love about my job and you love about your job. It's like, it's almost like looking at this child's maze and then navigating a way through it that is the least stressful path, but actually the most effective. And then you have to get the results. And I think you have to work out how you can navigate that one child. Every child is so different. Oh my goodness.
I assess children and there's never one exactly the same as the other. They're so different. They might not have all their reflexes. They might just have some. They might have balance issues or real alignment issues with their eyes, one side of their brain. Their semicircular canals might be off one side, or even just one. That's really going to be causing different symptoms and ailments that you're seeing, as well as behaviours. Or they might have all their reflexes. They're definitely going to have balance systems that are out, and then they're also got ocular problems. But everything can be. What I love about this is everything can be fixed and nobody tells you it can. Everyone just says, good luck. Good luck. Your child has a label now. Good luck. And even those labels are incorrect, because my son was misdiagnosed. So, I get pretty passionate about why focus on the label? Why don't you just work out what systems are wrong? Similar to what you've just said earlier, with all of the systems that impact or have a knock-on effect if one is actually off. I'm doing exactly the same. You're doing it from an internal perspective on how the body functions, with all of those different organ systems and requirements that need to go through that organ to then function properly to help another system function, and that whole knock-on effect. And I'm doing the same, but from a foundation up on the brain. And that's why it works so well in tandem when we do work together with children, because we start to see those effects happen from an internal chemistry perspective, and then I'm working from a foundational brain development from the brainstem where that child actually started and impacting that. And that's why, we're seeing the results we're seeing.
Yeah, I love it. And like you were saying, I saw a child yesterday and he's 12 and he has pandas and he's doing really well now. But he was told repeatedly by the NHS that, this is autism. And actually when he regressed into pandas, because that isn't a well-known thing in this country, especially at the moment, they were told, it's an autistic regression. Nothing.
And then you walk out the hospital and you go back to the house and he trashes the house and he has, moments where you find it so difficult to even cope with life. And what do you do for yourself? It doesn't put an environment in that help. There's no help. And that's why I need to do what I do and you need to do what you do in order to help as many families as possible get this out there, because there is, and I'm so emotionally, moved and driven by getting so much of this out to so many more parents, because it's just so incredibly important to understand that there is hope. There is the ability to change things. You just need to know what systems are imbalanced, and it's an imbalance and an immaturity. Yeah. If you can sort that out, and it will take a bit of time because it doesn't happen overnight, but if you're up for it, there are people out there like us that can help you.
Yeah, and there's so many case studies as well. There's so many parents who want to share their stories as well. Are like, I can't believe this has happened to me, because it is a miracle. It feels like a miracle because you're told so often that it can't be changed. And then when it finally, and it's like when Rose is like, I'm going to my friends tonight and we're, gonna whatever, I don't even know what they did round there, but just to have that for my child to be able to go, I'm going to a play date tonight, I'm going to a party, or just that normality of life that I desperately yearned, and to now be able to have that. Yeah. Which, I wanted, and I never thought that was possible from a mainstream allopathic narrative perspective, but there's changes happening, isn't there, at the moment? And hopefully, this is one day going to be, and this was what my goal was in my lifetime before I die, was that, when somebody got diagnosed with one of these neurodevelopmental disorders, that there was a path. Yeah. Actually from a mainstream perspective, not that they had to research like we did and go down 1,000 rabbit holes for 5 years. It was like, here you go, here's the path. This is what you have to do to help your child. And yeah, that would be amazing. And it's going to happen. It
will happen eventually, and we'll be part of that movement to make that happen. But thanks so much, Vicky. That was the most amazing explanation. And I really I know it's going to help so many people. There's going to be many more of these podcasts with you. And also there's going to be many more of those case study stories of bringing out what parents have actually done and to share their stories to ensure that everyone understands that there is a path to hope and change for our children. Thanks.
Thank you so much.